Picture a horse standing motionless on an empty stretch of prairie grass, and on its back a man wrapped in beadwork and buckskin who has not said a single W word yet, but who already commands the entire frame. Across from him, a director's leading man stands stripped bare and shouting at the open sky, utterly undone, while the man on the horse fights to keep a straight face. That moment, quiet and enormous at once, would go on to reshape how an entire industry portrayed native people on screen. And yet, almost nobody watching it in theaters in 1990 knew the secret sitting behind that calm, amused expression. The actor on that horse was not from the nation his character belonged to. He had never spoken the language his character spoke as his first language, and a decade and a half earlier, he had not been anywhere near a film set at all. He had been climbing steel beams on construction sites and installing carpet in a warehouse across the border in Rochester, New York, just trying to make it to his next paycheck. His name was Graham Greene, and by the time he died in 2025, his life had folded together an Academy Award nomination, a Grammy win, one of Canada's highs, T civilian honors, more than 180 screen credits, and a night in 1997 so dark that police spent 5 hours outside his home, called there by a friend who feared he would not survive it. This is the story of how a man with nothing built a career defined by refusing to disappear. Graham Greene was born on June 22, 1952, in Oswecon, a small community that sits inside the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve near Brantford, Ontario, the largest reserve by population in the whole of Canada. His father, John, worked as a paramedic and did maintenance work, and his mother, Lillian, raised the family through the kind of hardship that most people watching on this from comfortable homes would find difficult to picture. His co-cousin, the actor Gary Farmer, would later put it plainly. Greene grew up with nothing, and that early scarcity shaped nearly everything about the man he eventually became. By the age of 14, Greene had already left school behind and crossed the border into the United States, taking a job in a carpet warehouse in Rochester. Think about that for a moment. A 14-year-old alone, working in a foreign country with no financial cushion, no industry contacts, no long-term plan, just the next shift and the next paycheck standing between him and nothing at all. At 18, he came back across the border into Canada and signed up for a welding program at George Brown College in Toronto. And from there, his 20s turned into a blur of blue-collar work that most people would never survive, even one version of, let alone half a dozen. He trained and worked as a draftsman, a civil technician, a high steel worker balancing on structural beams high above the ground, a carpenter and a carpet layer before eventually drifting into the music world as a roadie and audio technician for rock bands touring out of Toronto. For a stretch, he even ran a small recording studio near Hamilton. Decades later, when he described that chapter of his life to an interviewer, he did it with the dry understatement that would become one of his trademarks, listing off carpenter, welder, draftsman, carpet layer, roadie, and audio technician, as though reciting a grocery list rather than a decade of survival. Most people would call a resume like that scattered or directionless. Greene called it an education, but none of it, by his own account, ever felt like where he was supposed to end up. It took a chance encounter with a musician to nudge him toward the stage at all. In the early 1970s, while working sound for touring acts around Toronto, Greene crossed paths with Kelly J, a member of the Canadian band Crowbar. Jay noticed something in Greene that Greene apparently had never noticed in himself, and he pushed, not gently and not just once, for Greene to try out for a local stage production. Greene resisted. In his own mind, he was the guy behind the mixing board, the one who set the equipment up and broke it back down at the end of the night, not someone who belonged in front of an audience. But Jay would not let the idea go, and Greene eventually gave in. His first meaningful stage credit came in 1976 in a touring production of James Reaney's play Wakusta, staged through the University of Western Ontario. He was 24 years old, with no formal training and no connections in the industry, starting completely from zero. When he later watched his first television appearance, a 1979 episode of a Canadian series called The Great Detective, his own verdict on his performance was blunt. It was bad. But instead of walking away from the embarrassment, he let it push him to actually learn the craft. He later summed up what drew him to film work with the same dry humor that colored so many of his interviews, comparing an actor's life on set to that of a well-kept dog. Fed, sheltered, led to a mark, told what to say, and led back again. He meant it by all accounts as a genuine compliment. That same unbothered, amused patience carried him through what would become nearly a decade of hard work and almost total public anonymity. Through most of the 1980s, Graham Greene occupied a strange and frustrating position. Critics who saw his stage work adored him, while the wider public had essentially no idea who he was. His film debut came in 1983 in Running Brave, a dramatization of the life of Olympic runner Billy Mills. 2 years after that, he shared the screen with Al Pacino in Revolution. He worked steadily on the CBC series Spirit Bay, and in 1989 alone he appeared in both Pow Wow Highway and Where the Spirit Lives. But it was the theater, not the screen, where his reputation was truly built. That same year, 1989, Greene won the Dora Maver Moore Award, widely regarded as Toronto's equivalent of an off-Broadway Tony, for his performance as the amiable drunk Pierre St. Pierre in Thompson Highway's Dry Lips Oughta Move to Kapuskasing, staged by Native Earth Performing Arts. Critics who saw it described the production as among the finest examples of Indigenous theatre ever staged in the country, and almost no one beyond Canada's borders ever heard about it. 2 years later, in 1991, Greene reprised that role at Toronto as Royal Alexandra Theatre, in what became the first production written by an Indigenous playwright and performed entirely by an Indigenous cast ever to appear on that stage, a genuine milestone in Canadian theatrical history. And yet, while Greene was earning standing ovations in Toronto, Hollywood was still casting non-native actors in redface and calling the results authentic. Nobody from the studios was flying to Ontario to scout Indigenous theatre. Arguably, the most gifted native actor of his generation remained functionally invisible to the people who controlled film budgets and casting decisions. Greene wanted a bigger stage than the one he already had. And, in 1990, that bigger stage came calling in the form of a phone call from Kevin Costner. Costner was searching for an actor who could embody Kicking Bird, the thoughtful Lakota medicine man at the emotional center of Dances with Wolves, a role demanding warmth, sharp intelligence, understated humor, and quiet dignity, often within the same scene. He found that combination in Graham Greene. There was, however, one enormous complication. Greene was Oneida, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy rooted in the woodlands of what is now Ontario, not the Great Plains. He was not Lakota, had never lived among Lakota communities, and, perhaps most strikingly, did not even speak his own Oneida language fluently, let alone Lakota. Generations of forced cultural suppression through the residential school system had made sure of that. Greene later explained to an industry interviewer that he'd never learned to speak his own language, because an earlier generation had been actively taught not to. A loss, he said, that felt something like forgetting your own heart. So rather than treat the Lakota dialogue as something to memorize phonetically, Greene committed to studying the language roughly 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, until every line landed with real understanding rather than imitation. Lakota's grammar bore no resemblance to English or French, and by his own account he struggled to make sense of its underlying structure at first. But he refused to simply mouth sounds he didn't comprehend. He wanted to know exactly what he was saying in every prayer, every aside, every quiet exchange with Kevin Costner's character by the fire. Costner, for his part, had mortgaged his own house to get the film finished. Greene matched that financial risk with sheer effort. When audiences finally saw him on screen, in what one Indigenous media outlet later called one of the great character entrances in film history, they were seeing something Hollywood had essentially never offered before. A native man portrayed with total dignity and warmth, striking in his beadwork and buckskin, completely at ease on horseback, who could pivot within moments into genuine physical comedy, the instant Costner's unclothed character started shouting at the sky. Greene had told Costner directly that his people were among the funniest anyone would ever meet, and the performance proved it. Off camera, Greene reportedly bonded closely with the horse he rode throughout filming. And, on the final day of the shoot, a young boy told him the horse he'd trained with had originally belonged to his family before financial necessity forced them to sell it. Greene reportedly went straight to the production team and insisted the boy get his horse back, telling them to take the cost out of his own salary if that's what it required. It's a small story, but it says a great deal about the person behind the performance that made him famous. On March 25th, 1991, Graham Greene sat in the audience at the 63rd Academy Awards as a nominee for Best Supporting Actor, up against Bruce Davison for Longtime Companion, Andy Garcia for The Godfather Part 3, Al Pacino for Dick Tracy, and Joe Pesci for Goodfellas. When the envelope opened, Pesci's name was the one read aloud, and he delivered what remains one of the shortest acceptance speeches in the show's history. A handful of words, and he was done. Greene went home without the statue, but what happened that night mattered for reasons that went well beyond who took home the trophy. Greene became the first Oneida actor ever nominated for an Academy Award, and only the second Indigenous performer in the history of the Best Supporting Actor category, following Chief Dan George's nomination in 1970 for Little Big Man. As of Greene's death in 2025, he and Chief Dan George remain the only two Indigenous actors ever nominated in that specific category. Two names across more than 90 years of Academy Award history. Dances with Wolves itself, meanwhile, went on to earn 12 nominations and win 7, including Best Picture and Best Director for Costner, grossing roughly $184 million domestically and well over $400 million worldwide, against a production budget of about $22 million. The film reshaped, almost overnight, how mainstream American cinema was willing to depict Native people, and Greene stood at the very center of that shift. But an Oscar nomination, it turned out, did not shield him from an industry that still, in many rooms, saw his identity as a limitation rather than an asset. And what came next tested that reality directly. Greene was unusually candid throughout his career about exactly what Hollywood expected of native actors when he was coming up. He recalled being handed scripts that reduced native characters to a narrow caricature, stoic, humorless, mostly grunting rather than speaking. A portrayal, he said, bore no resemblance to any native person he had ever actually known, given how much humor genuinely ran through his own community. He also spoke more than once about how thoroughly mainstream media had erased native characters altogether, joking bitterly that his people seemed to simply vanish from the screen the moment anyone looked away. He also resisted being boxed in by his own identity in the press, pointing out that reporters rarely described Denzel Washington as a black actor or Kevin Costner as a white actor, yet felt entitled to attach native actor to his own name as though it were the whole of his professional identity. One particularly sharp exchange came during an audition for Crimson Tide, when director Tony Scott reportedly told him he simply couldn't picture a Native American serving aboard a submarine. Greene's response, as he later recounted it, was immediate and pointed. He told Scott that if he could picture it, he'd be able to explain that possibility to Greene's own relatives, 4 uncles who had died serving on submarines in the Pacific during the war, 4 men from his own family who had died defending a country that had spent generations trying to erase people like them, and a director sitting across a casting table still couldn't picture a native man doing the same job. By most accounts, the room went quiet after that. But Greene wasn't the type to dwell on a closed door. His stated approach to rejection was simple: don't let it eat at you, just keep moving. And move he did, straight into what became one of the most prolific stretches any character actor of his generation would enjoy. Between 1991 and 1999, Graham Greene assembled a body of work that most actors would envy, largely by deliberately seeking out roles that either sidestepped his ethnicity entirely or actively upended what a native character on screen was traditionally allowed to be. In 1991, he starred in the Canadian film Clear Cut, playing a vengeful spirit who takes brutal revenge on a forestry executive, a performance later described by Indigenous media as among the most ferocious in Canadian cinema. In 1992, he played tribal police officer Walter Crowhorse in Thunderheart, opposite Val Kilmer, a role he reportedly signed onto almost instantly once he heard it would be shot in South Dakota, and involved riding a motorcycle, supposedly telling his agent he didn't even need to read the script first. That same year, he took the title role in HBO's The Last of His Tribe, portraying Ishi, widely regarded as the last surviving member of the Yahi people. 2 years later, in 1994's Maverick, opposite Mel Gibson, Greene played Joseph, a con artist who convinces a wealthy Russian archduke to pay for the chance to hunt what he's led to believe is a real Indian, a premise that quietly subverted the very stereotypes Greene had spent years pushing back against, with a native character firmly in control of the con rather than its victim. Reviewers at the time singled him out as one of the funniest parts of the entire film. In 1995, he appeared in Die Hard with a Vengeance as NYPD Detective Joe Lambert, standing alongside Bruce Willis and Samuel L. Jackson as simply a cop doing his job. Not a chief, not a tracker, not a mystical guide, just a New York police detective, with his ethnicity never once treated as the point of the character. Then, in 1999, came The Green Mile, in which Greene played death row inmate Arlen Bitterbuck, known within the story as the Chief, the first prisoner executed on screen in the film. His final scene remains one of the more quietly devastating moments in the film, built around a simple question he poses before walking to the execution chamber, asking whether enough repentance might let a person return to the happiest moment of their life and remain there forever. That line carries a very different weight once you understand what Greene himself was privately living through during that same period of his career. On a Friday afternoon in March of 1997, at roughly 4:30 in the afternoon, York Regional Police received a call concerning Greene's home south of Lake Simcoe, about 50 kilometers north of Toronto. A family friend had contacted authorities, afraid that Greene was in immediate danger of taking his own life. What followed was an approximately 5-hour standoff involving an emergency response team before Greene finally agreed to go to York County Hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. He was 44 years old at the time, already one of the most recognizable Indigenous actors working anywhere in the world, and privately in what by any account was one of the most frightening places a person can be. Contemporary news coverage described the situation as connected to personal difficulties involving family and friends, without going into further detail. In later years, Greene spoke about that period with a level of honesty that few actors of his stature are willing to offer publicly. He talked openly about depression and about struggles with alcohol, describing a period he referred to metaphorically as diving into the well, just to see how far down it went. He later told an interviewer that he came out of that experience not destroyed, but changed, a better performer in his own words, and a better person, marked by a deeper sense of tolerance. It's worth sitting with that word for a moment, because it wasn't anger or bitterness that he said the experience left him with, but patience. Patience with himself and with the people around him. Plenty of people would have used a night like that as a reason to step away from the business entirely, to retreat and never pick up another script. Greene did the opposite. He went back to work. He kept showing up on time, knowing his lines, treating the work with the same seriousness he always had, and by every account, he never used that night as an excuse for anything that came afterward. He described it, essentially, as a place he visited once, climbed back out of, and never returned to. Most audiences who watched him over the following decades had no idea that night in 1997 had ever happened. What they knew was that Graham Greene simply kept appearing again and again in roles both large and small. In Canada, he became a genuinely beloved comic figure, playing the dynamite-obsessed Edgar Montrose on The Red Green Show for well over a decade, earning Gemini Award recognition along the way, and later hosted the true crime documentary series Exhibit A. In 2000, he won a Grammy Award for Best Spoken Word Album for Children, sharing the honor alongside Kate Winslet and Wynton Marsalis, a genuinely remarkable outcome for a man who had once made his living laying carpet in an American warehouse. In 2007, he returned to the stage at the prestigious Stratford Festival, taking on both Shylock in The Merchant of Venice and Lenny in Of Mice and Men, two of the most demanding roles available in English-language theater, performed live with no editing, no retakes, and no safety net, much the way he had approached nearly everything in his working life. Rather than slowing down as he aged, his roles seemed to grow in scope. In 2017, he played Tribal Police Chief Ben in Wind River, a film whose closing text pointedly noted the absence of reliable missing person statistics for Native American women, unlike nearly every other demographic tracked in the United States. He appeared as Judge Foxman in Aaron Sorkin's Molly's Game, reportedly joking on set about experiencing a courtroom from the judge's chair rather than the witness stand for once. He lent his voice to the character Chief Rainsfall in the video game Red Dead Redemption 2. He appeared as Scully in Marvel's Echo, and in the final season of Reservation Dogs in 2023, he played a character named Maximus, sharing scenes with fellow veteran actor Wes Studi, and, notably, with his own cousin Gary Farmer, three men from roughly the same generation who had each spent decades pushing for the simple right to be portrayed on screen as complete, complicated human beings rather than stereotypes. Greene and Farmer had reportedly performed comedy together at Six Nations community events when they were young men, long before either of them had any real career in front of a camera. Decades later, they found themselves sharing a set as elders in an acclaimed series largely written and produced by Indigenous creators. That full circle arc, in its own quiet way, means more than any single award could. The honors did keep arriving throughout his final years, regardless. Wilfrid Laurier University awarded him an honorary Doctor of Laws degree in 2008. He was made a member of the Order of Canada in 2015, one of the country's highest civilian distinctions. He received a star on Canada's Walk of Fame in 2021. And in 2025, not long before his death, he received the Governor-General's Performing Arts Award for Lifetime Artistic Achievement, widely regarded as the highest honor the country bestows on its artists. At that ceremony, he reportedly said simply how good it felt to keep working in Canada, with no need to have gone anywhere else to be recognized for it. A small statement that captured something fairly essential about how he approached his entire career. He married producer Hilary Blackmore in 1990, and the two remained married for 35 years, until his death. He had a daughter, Lily, from an earlier relationship with actress Carol Lazar and a grandson named Tarlo. He lived outside Toronto with his wife, and according to people who knew him, a fairly substantial number of cats. He built boats in his spare time. He wrote, he played golf, which he once described as essentially a game you play against yourself. And he flatly refused, throughout his entire career, to relocate to Los Angeles, reasoning publicly that there was no real need to, since a working actor could live basically anywhere as long as they had a phone, a way to send documents, and knew how to get themselves to an airport. At the time of his death, a documentary about his life, titled No Reservation Required, was reportedly in production, led by filmmaker Carl Goldstein, who had first crossed paths with Greene as a first assistant director on Die Hard with a Vengeance back in 1995, 30 years earlier, and by his own account still trying to fully capture what made Greene such an unusual and enduring figure. On September 1st, 2025, Graham Greene died in Stratford, Ontario, at the age of 73. His manager, Report ED, that he had passed away following a lengthy illness, though the specific nature of that illness was never made public. Tributes followed quickly from across the industry. Kevin Costner, the man who Ho had first cast him more than 3 decades earlier, called him a master of his craft and a genuinely good human being. Actress Lily Gladstone said he had lived on screen in a way that felt truly unmatched. a programmer from the Toronto Internatie. Onall Film Festival credited him with having knocked down doors that made space for many of the Indigenous-led films now being produced today. And a farewell statement from his own representative has put it about as simply and as movingly as anything could. He was finally free. Graham Greene spent roughly 15 years welding steel, laying carpet, and hauling sound equipment before he ever set foot on a professional stage. He spee. And 8 hours a day, mastering a language that was not his own in order to bring dignity to a role that changed how an entire industry approached Native representation. He survived a night in 1997 that would have ended most people's years, if not more, and turned that survival into a source of patience rather than bitterness. He told a Hollywood director without flinching about 4 uncles who died defending a country that H-Naw had tried for generations to erase people like them. And across roughly 50 years of work, he proved again and again that the funniest, warmest, most stubborn kid to come out of the Six Nations Reserve could become one of the finest actors his co-country ever produced, without asking a single person's permission to do it. The man on that horse in South Dakota, the one nobody in the theater knew was speaking a language he'd only just learned, turned out to be telling the truth the whole time. He never really did disappear.